All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking time to join us today. We're going to give our guests a few more minutes to log in and get situated before we start our program. So bear with us another minute or two. All right, good afternoon again. Thank you all for taking time to join us for our 1 Million Teachers of Color quarterly webinar. My name is Javaid Siddiqui. I have the good fortune of serving as the president and CEO of the Hunt Institute. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to informing elected officials and policymakers about key issues. Clearly, one of those issues is around educator diversity. The Institute is a proud founding member of the 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign, which aims to add 1 million more teachers of color and 30,000 school leaders of color to the workforce by 2030. Our campaign includes 8 steering committee organizations, 2 of whom are grateful that they're taking time to be on this webinar with us today. My friend and esteemed colleague, Amanda Fernandez, who leads Latinos for Education, and joining us from our partner, Teach Plus, being represented by an amazing educator and school leader, is an alumni fellow in the Teach Plus network, is Ralph St. Louis. So I thank you all for being with us for our webinar today. In October 2023, 1 Million Teachers of Color launched our state-by-state map, which shows both student to teacher and also student to leader gaps in states. In addition to the map, it shows us a number of teachers and leaders needed to close these gaps and bring parity between teachers and leaders on the school community or in the school communities they serve. This data is critical for advancing educator diversity initiatives across the nation. Clearly, we know lawmakers need to be made aware of this data, many of whom, as in our work across the country, are just completely oblivious to the lack of educator diversity represented in our schools. So it's impendent on all of us in our campaign to continue to get the message out. And I encourage you, if you haven't heard, please join us in this very, very important work. As I mentioned already, today I'm joined by my friend Amanda Fernandez and Ralph St. Louis. Her organization focuses on cultivating, placing, and linking vital Latino leadership while also mobilizing Latino voices to advocate for practices and policies that eliminate obstacles to fair educational opportunities. We're also joined by Dr. Olivia Chi, who is an assistant professor in educational leadership and policy studies department at Boston University Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. Dr. Chi has co-published a paper on Massachusetts teacher turnover during the first 2 years of the pandemic, and has recently led research on the state educator diversity in Massachusetts during the 2020-2021 school year. And last but certainly not least, Ralph St. Louis, who is a senior education policy fellow at Teach Plus Massachusetts and a biology and chemistry teacher at Lowell High School. In 2020, Ralph has been recognized with numerous accolades for his role as a teacher, education advocate, including the Massachusetts Association of Science Teachers Science Educator of the Year Award for Middlesex County, and Time Magazine's 10 Innovative Teachers Nationwide. So we got a great group here lined up. I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to ask for all of you to maybe just state your name and maybe a quick 1 or 2 minute summary of your organization and the work you are representing here today. If you're okay, we'll start with Amanda Fernandez.
Hi, good afternoon. Javaid, thank you for your warm welcome. And I'm just so glad to be here with all of you today. Again, Amanda Fernandez, I'm the CEO and founder of Latinos for Education. As Javaid said, we develop, place, and connect essential Latino leadership in the education sector. We also do the advocacy and policy work that removes barriers to educational opportunity. I founded the organization now going on 8 years ago. And we are the first national Latino education nonprofit that focuses on the work that we do. But we've been particularly just excited to see the progress we can make on educator diversity through policy and advocacy. And so I'll look forward to just saying more about our journey in Massachusetts and some of the aims that we have at a federal level, as well as our participation with you all, Hunt Institute, Teach Plus, as members of the steering committee of the Coalition for 1 Million Teachers of Color. So with that, I will hand it over back to you, Javed, for the next intro. Glad to be here today.
Thank you. Ralph, we'll go with you, and then we'll end with Dr. Chi for intros.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your amazing introduction of me. I sometimes forget that I keep so busy. Right now, I'm representing Teach Plus Massachusetts. I am a senior policy fellow for Teach Plus. I also sit on the National Policy Board, and we are an organization that focuses on empowering teachers from across the nation to really be involved in the educational advocacy space. And we build up their toolkit so that they can take their lived experience and knowledge from the classroom into the legislative space so that we can really make the change that we need to see. I also have to note that I am a classroom teacher in Lowell Public Schools, Massachusetts. I teach biology, chemistry, and ESL science, and I'm a sixth-year teacher, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation today. Is my camera working? I can't actually tell.
Yeah, you may want to turn it on and off, Ralph. I was gonna jump in and advise. While you're working on that, here you go, great. Dr. Chi, please.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University's Wheelock College of Education and Human Development. In my work, I study teacher labor markets and measures of teacher quality. And so this conversation is sort of near and dear to my heart and what I do every day. And so in my research, I primarily use administrative data sets from states and districts to answer questions about the teacher workforce. And so recently, as mentioned, I've done a lot of work with the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, DESE, and much of that work examines the diversity of the teacher workforce. So a big part of what I do is like taking some of that work and putting it in conversation with our colleagues at DESE to engage in conversations that are relevant for policymaking. We also put our work out in publicly available working papers and reports and policy briefs, and to make sure that type of information is accessible more widely. And so I'm really excited for this conversation. I'll turn it back to you, Javed.
Thank you, Dr. Chi. I'm actually going to come right back to you. You mentioned the research. I mentioned it in the opening remarks. We've been dealing with a lot of lawmakers, and licensure has been a very common theme conversation across the different states, both red states and blue states, certainly purple states. You conducted a research analysis on emergency licensure and how licensure could be a barrier to retention. Can you please share some of your findings here? I know we have some educators, certainly some lawmakers that are joining us. I think it would be impactful for their thinking, as I know this is an issue that's being grappled with across different legislative bodies.
Yeah, so I'd say this started with a lot of work that began during the pandemic. And so first, we started some work just looking at teacher turnover early on in the pandemic within those first 2 years. And during that time, we were examining the fact that turnover was going up for a lot of teachers going into the second year of the pandemic. And so we were also looking at who are the folks who are coming into the teacher workforce. And we saw that in Massachusetts, over the past number of years, even way before the pandemic, newly hired teachers have become more diverse over time, and that trend continued during the pandemic. And we suspected that it's in part related to something about licensure requirements, as you're pointing to. And so during the pandemic in Massachusetts, because of the closing of testing centers and the closing of schools, the typical teacher candidate wasn't able to complete their requirements. Like they couldn't take their licensure exams, they couldn't complete their student teaching. And so out of necessity, the state created emergency teaching licenses that really allowed anyone with a bachelor's degree to obtain an emergency license and then become eligible to become a classroom teacher. So in some joint work with my colleagues at BU, Andrew Bacher-Hicks and Ariel Tickner-Wagner and Sidra Baloch, so we did a study in partnership with Massachusetts DESE to examine who are the folks who entered the Massachusetts classrooms under the emergency teaching license. And we see that the folks who did gain employment with emergency licenses are indeed a really unique group. It included folks who were engaged in the teacher pipeline already, but they couldn't previously meet the existing licensure requirements. It also included some folks who were already employed in Massachusetts public schools, so folks who were formerly paraprofessionals. Some of those folks went on to get teacher licenses and become like the lead classroom teacher. And among this group, importantly, we see that these new hires holding these emergency licenses, they were substantially more racially diverse than their peers with traditional licenses. They were much more likely to be either Black or Hispanic Latinx. And survey results that we've seen suggest that these teachers very much want to stay in the profession in Massachusetts public schools. And so these folks, they're playing a very important role in the current teacher workforce, but they do have to complete these traditional teacher requirements in order to remain in the workforce on a longer term basis. And so we see that they need some additional supports to meet those requirements and remain in the classroom. And also in a recently released brief related to our follow-up looking at emergency teachers with these licenses, we see that those who were assigned to teach in tested grades and subjects, they seem to perform as well in terms of raising test scores as those with more traditional licenses. And so taking all of these bits together, like I think our results do have to be taken with some caution. Like we have 1 year of data looking at, some of these measures of teacher quality. It's a really unique context, not a huge sample. So with all that caution in mind, I do think that it encourages policymakers to consider some flexibility in how they think about licensure requirements, particularly for those individuals who've had engagement with the teacher pipeline or they've worked in public schools, but they weren't able to meet the exact requirements as written. And so to the state's credit, I think they're already doing, they're like exploring options with what they're looking at. It's the MTEL Flex, like the MTEL is the licensure test in Massachusetts, and they're doing some work with what they're calling the MTEL Flex to look at some alternatives. And so I would say that our work, it doesn't imply that we should just remove all requirements. I don't think that that's what our work is stating in this moment, given that our work took place in a super unique context. There's a pandemic, it was a super unique group of teachers who were kind of waiting in the wings, so to speak, to be able to enter the classroom. So it was a really unique group. But that being said, I think the results do urge the policymakers to consider ways to increase flexibility in a way that makes sense, such that you could allow more teachers of color to enter the workforce.
Thank you for that. We know the research is very clear on licensure exams not being really an indicator of good or bad in regards to teacher performance. So I think your data, while I can sense that you're sort of providing some guideposts here on what the takeaways might be, we're excited about what year 2 will provide. I think there is a cautionary tale here, and we as folks that are sort of carrying the flag are likely positioned to be ambassadors for diversifying the workforce. We have to be careful not to run and jump for something like this easy, low-hanging fruit, and then the data comes back and we've had something sort of blow up in our face that, well, now we've lost control of this. And yes, we let more people of color into the classrooms, but their data, the performance data is not really bearing out. I'm hopeful, given what we know about licensure exams and what the research tells us, that that's not going to be the case. So we will stay tuned for year 2 and 3 and so on. Let me come over to you, Amanda. Latinos for Education has played an integral role in advocating for diverse educator workforce, specifically in Massachusetts, by joining forces with other individuals and other organizations. What has your collaboration strategy with Dr. Chi and BU Wheelock look like, and how have you used their research in developing specific steps for increasing diversity in Massachusetts?
Thank you for your question. If I may just add one anecdote to Dr. Chi's comments, because I happen to be on the Board of Education during that time where emergency license were issued. And I'll just add that what we're hearing from superintendents, so the anecdotal aspect of the data is our superintendents that we interact with and engage with speak very highly of the opportunities that are afforded through emergency licensure and as a means and what's borne out to be a much more diverse workforce through that. So yes, the data still needs to bear out, but anecdotally, you are hearing the support from many superintendents about how successful that's been and the additional investments and supports that should be given to the educators who continue to be on emergency license. So I just wanted to add that, but in answer to your question, so again, based here in Massachusetts, just for a little context for those of you who may not know, in 2020, Latinos for Education convened a coalition of over 50 organizations across the educator pipeline. This had not been done before, and there are more organizations and institutions, but we were able to convene 50 to create a policy proposal that's now known as the Educator Diversity Act. Since that time, the coalition in support of the bill has amassed significant support. In the last legislative session, we were able to obtain 50 legislative co-sponsors. And in fact, the two education co-chairs at the time are the sponsors of the bill. So in the last legislative session, we were able to secure some funding, but unfortunately, we did fall short of the bill becoming policy. So we're back at it. We're in the second session. So in terms of the collaboration strategy, the research and data that Dr. Chi and BU Wheelock have engaged with us on is really an important engagement tool for us at Latinos for Education and for our coalition, because it helps to form the narrative about why we need legislation like the Educator Diversity Act and similar legislation. So we've been really great at telling the stories of the educators of why diversification matters. But this data that BU Wheelock has been able to produce solidifies and creates this really strong, important narrative about why diversification matters. It's been instrumental in terms of us, through partnerships, through mobilization and amplification, to galvanize folks to act on policy, both on the Educator Diversity Act and similarly situated legislation. So again, with the BU Wheelock research in particular, we've had the opportunity to share that with our network, including at UMass Lowell, and that's University of Massachusetts in Lowell, and recently the Department of Education conference in Denver. So we're now talking about it. While it's not officially out, this data is a tool that we're using to really support and again, sort of really build out the story we need to tell and for legislators to hear.
Thank you, Amanda. Ralph, I'm going to come to you with your experience as a science teacher being a senior policy fellow at Teach Plus. How has teacher diversity data influenced your strategies in the classroom and advocacy for recruiting and retaining a more diverse cohort of educational leaders?
Yeah, if to the people who know me, they really consider me a data geek. So I really enjoy like combing through this data and having a better understanding of the landscape of educator diversity. But for me, I'd say it really began with a local grassroots advocacy group in the city that I work and live in, the Lowell Education Justice Alliance. They brought to my attention the critical disparity in our local schools. And they recognized that in Lowell, while 75% of the students are of color, only 8% of the teachers were represented the same background. And this was during at the height of the pandemic, while we were still closed, that I started to dive into this data of really recognizing that this gap matters, because diverse teachers often raise the expectations for students of color, lead to better academic achievement, and fewer suspensions. And really, most importantly to me, is that positive exposure to individuals from a variety of races, ethnic groups, especially in childhood, for all students can help reduce stereotypes, eliminate unconscious and implicit biases, and help promote cross-cultural bonding. The knowledge of these findings have really influenced my strategies in countless ways, but there are like 3 quick ones that I'd like to highlight. First, I was lucky enough to be able to participate in my district-sponsored Diverse Teacher Leader Fellowship, which recruits diverse educators across our 28 schools for professional development and to tackle a problem of practice. My colleague and I opted into auditing our entire district's hiring and recruitment practices. We conducted a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, to identify areas of improvements and recommendations made recommendations to our district leaders and school committee members. And 4 years later, we've seen actually quite significant progress. I get goosebumps when I think of how many recommendations have seen fruition. We've moved from 8% to 12% in Lowell Public Schools. And we know like something special is happening here, and data was leading the way. Secondly, my curiosity about the district-wide approach started to expand outside of my district, to where I started connecting and creating a professional learning group or community with 5 or 6 district human resource offices. We shared some strategies and insights and really tried to see how we can do this better together. Outside of the district, alongside Teach Plus, I've been facilitating the Educator Diversity Working Group, where teacher leaders from across the Commonwealth focus on leveraging their classroom experience to advocate for their schools effectively, creating more teacher leaders who are really at the intersection of practice and policy, and building their toolkit to advocate for the students in front of them. As teachers, we experience firsthand the implications of policies that are made at state, district, and building level. So we are often the best people to speak to about the specifics of what needs to be changed in service of an equitable learning environment. And third, the last thing is that to address the discontinuity, the disconnected nature of the discussions across the Commonwealth, as some had mentioned prior, and what I learned through those district HR PLCs, we saw that there was a high need to organize a statewide summit on rebuilding the teacher workforce with UMass Lowell, Great Schools Partnership, Harvard Rappaport Center. Our aim was to create a collaborative space to deepen the understanding, connect with community partners, and unite all stakeholders who are involved in advancing educator diversity. And the summit was truly a data-driven strategic approach to a more cohesive approach to enhancing educator diversity. And the last thing I will add is that regarding the classroom, like right now, I'm occasionally sharing these advocacy experiences with my students to show that their expressed concerns are being addressed. And this educates them about the importance of civic engagement.
Thank you, Ralph. We recently facilitated a third iteration of an annual poll to citizens, voters, Republicans, Democrats, Independents nationally. And we actually baked in some questions around educator diversity. This is not an area that a lot of voters are considering and thinking about, the need to diversify our workforce. While those of us that are advocating for And those of us that are doing research and those that are like in the classroom or in the schools, we see it every day. We're aware of it. I think we all have a collective responsibility to be encouraging and educating voters also about why this is important. So I say that I know we have a number of people on the joining us today. I want to remind all of our guests that we are going to start taking questions from our audience here shortly. I have one more question for each of our guests, and then I will turn my attention to audience questions. So please do chat your questions in, and I will curate them accordingly. Amanda, come back to you. Latinos for Education is currently advocating for the Massachusetts Educator Diversity Act that will likely, hopefully, or potentially serve as a model for a national bill. How are you using data to convince lawmakers that teacher diversity is a pressing issue?
Well, of course, to start with, we are looking for a bipartisan solution to reimagine the teaching profession so all of our students are better served, both in the Commonwealth and, as you mentioned, ultimately throughout the nation. So with that, we consider our legislators partners in the work, just as we do our coalition members, et cetera. And so like anyone in our network, we share data with them to support what they are doing to champion educator diversity legislation. We are in the State House constantly. We, again, feel just really excited that we have new data that will support a need in the Commonwealth, because we will never reach the current goals that we have around diversifying the educator workforce on the current track that we're on. And you have to be able to present that kind of data because it matters to legislators. It's tangible. They can work with it. They can understand it. And it's, both head and heart, right? So we also have to tell the stories of our educators and the impact on their students when they have an educator that either shares their background or is an educator of color. So it just goes hand in hand. And again, we want to make sure our legislators are equipped with the information that they need to make the best decisions. And hopefully that is in support of our bill. Regarding the Federal Educator Diversity Act, again, we're part of 1 million teachers because this is not solely a Massachusetts issue, as we all know. But we want to be able to see this legislation as a potential model that could work across the nation. There are many provisions of this bill that we think are relevant and could be replicated in different states, while also knowing that some aspects of the provisions that we've put together in certain states, we'd have to adapt and adjust. Lastly, again, we want to bring stories to life and enact policy, as I said. So it's important we come together with legislators so that they can also bring to life the stories that they hear from us and that they hear from educators in their own districts, so that they can talk to families in their districts and feel equipped and ready to have those conversations. So we hope that in the end, that with the data, as well as with the stories, that inevitably those stories will turn into policy.
Thank you. Dr. Chi, what ways do you envision your study helping the public learn more about teacher diversity, and how can the need for a diverse teacher workforce become a prominent topic of conversations in households everywhere?
So before diving into the specifics of like my context, I do want to make the plug that I think that there's so much great research that's been done recently, and also like additional research that I know folks are working on right now that are continuing to raise the importance and help us even better understand the importance of teacher diversity, not just for how individual teachers of color are directly impacting their students, but for example, how they're impacting the learning of their white teacher peers. I'm thinking of like some work that Constance Lindsay and Seth Gershenson and their colleagues are working on that shows the importance of learning, not just for those students, but for their white teachers who have teachers of color colleagues, and for the students of those white teachers. And so I think that to continue making this a prominent topic. Like, I think folks need to continue doing that type of work. In the specific context that I'm engaged in the MA context, as I was saying before, I think our work on licensure, it signals that there are indeed promising opportunities to help diversify the workforce. There are policies that we can push on to help make it easier to diversify the workforce. And in the context of licensure, like thinking about ways to make it more flexible in a way that it makes sense to allow more teachers of color to enter the profession. And to like make this a more prominent topic from the standpoint of like researchers who are doing this work, I think it's our job to continue to connect with policymakers, continue to engage with organizations like Latinos for Education, continue to engage with the media to make sure that the evidence is out there, that it's being publicized, and that people understand what the research is showing. And so that people are equipped to speak to the importance of it and to have that evidence right in front of them to be able to convince legislators and policymakers of just how important this is. And so I as a researcher, and us as a community of researchers, I think we need to continue to do our part to sort of bridge that gap between research and practice and public engagement, to make this more of a household conversation.
Thank you, Dr. G. Ralph, how can accessible data on teacher diversity and its role in student performance compel potential and current teachers of color to join or stay in the educator workforce? And what type of support has helped you in your role as an educator of color?
I first want to say that I could not agree more that this needs to be with Dr. Chi and Dr. Fernandez, that it is significant that we really pay attention to what are our communities having conversations around about our education space. Data really drove that in Lowell Public Schools with our participatory action-based research project, where we really tried to redesign what education looks like for our students. And in that process, that conversation of educator diversity started to become a household conversation at the local grassroots level. So it's by engaging your local constituents, you can truly get them to advocate at the school committee, at the city council, of which we are seeing, and even our students. So having that accessible qualitative and quantitative data to build that narrative in that context can be a powerful and transformative tool to shed light on that correlation between demographics of teacher workforce and student outcomes, a relationship that's already quite well documented in the education literature. And also, I'd say, like, reflecting on this, I'm reminded of a recent DESE Department of Ed newsletter in Massachusetts that reported 22% of students were chronically absent during the last school year. That means that they have been absent for at least 10% of the school year. And as a current classroom teacher, I see this every day. I see the impact of their absenteeism. And this statistic highlights the critical need to develop and foster a sense of belonging in the classroom and support our schools so students again find joy in the classroom to become lifelong learners, regardless of the adversity that they face. For me, it's not really about the data that that's proven the effect of diverse educators in the classroom, but it's the relationships that we all innately try to build and the relationships that I am able to build with my students every year. In the correct environment, a true teacher will thrive and never want to leave the workforce. The more data that we have that provides us the ability to make those data-driven insights, to build an ecosystem that supports all teachers, especially educators of diverse background, it will support us building a robust workforce that wants to stay in the classroom, that can support our students through their educational experience and become a near peer role model for them that increases their academics and increases their sense of belonging. And most importantly, it will also inspire them to consider a future career in education, to give back what they received during their educational experience. And lastly, I also want to say that the Educator Diversity Act is a essential step in modeling really across the nation what needs to be done in terms of data, as it allows us to tackle this nationwide shortage and educator diversity. And one of the components is creating a data dashboard, as I actually recommended in my SWOT analysis project way back during COVID and seen implemented in my district. It really provides school leaders a tangible tool to track and analyze and make some more effective data-driven decisions. And like, one small anecdote I want to add into that is we really need to pay attention to the staffing of our administrative spaces, specifically human resources and data scientists. We are demanding of them to collect, disaggregate, and really create some informed recommendations while we are not actually staffing them at the capacity at their need levels to meet those demands. And there's plenty of data out there to show the impact of having a robust human resource office. And I think that one of the best things that they could help us do in understanding what are the challenges for educators are those exit interviews. We may have tons of data, but we really need to know the context around why are people coming and going.
Thank you, Ralph. Actually, so our first question from the audience. I think I'm going to have Amanda take this one, but feel free if you others raise your hand, I'll let you chime in. If not, we'll go to more questions. We can limit the responses. That would be great. But probably should have taken a moment to acknowledge our teammates in this endeavor. TNTP, MCEL, I see Harrison Peters is here. CBED, Center for Black Educator Development, new leaders, Latinos, obviously, Teach Plus, and Ed Trust. So all of us are organizations sort of advocating for this issue, working on this issue. But the question, Amanda, is there specific language from the research and or a bill that community-based organizations could focus on that are focused on teacher diversity could leverage or point to garner financial or advocacy support?
Yeah, so there is a provision in the bill that is about creating an educator diversity grant fund that's specifically targeted at programs and practices that are designed to increase educator diversity and retention. And the way we've designed it is that the funding is subject to annual appropriation from the legislature and does require evaluation to ensure compliance with all provisions. So I think, you know, we do have that in the bill. I will also just say that the Department of Education in Massachusetts is providing grants, right? So I think to support districts who want to work on diversifying their educator workforce. So I think that's just another angle, is to work in partnership with districts that are trying to create a comprehensive approach to diversifying the educator workforce. And there is opportunity to create those partnerships with districts directly who are receiving some of that funding to support those community-based organizations, because we know that districts can't do it all. They need to get the support within district, but they also need to look at outside partners such as those that are part of our coalition. So those are a couple of ways that I think there can be funding obtained for community-based organizations to be able to support the statewide goals, you know, and be able to reach them.
Okay, seeing head nodding, I think we're ready for the next question. Ralph, sorry. Yes, sir.
I'll just add a quick note. I think we also need to be moderately concerned, really, about the physical cliff that is about to hit our schools with the ESSER funds running out, and the impact to our hiring pool or the current staff that we have. A lot of the teachers that had entered the field over the last 3 or so years are on the who are diverse, are on emergency licenses or initial licenses, so they are the first one in. And I am constantly thinking about what will happen when those emergency licenses disappear and they have to now jump through the hoops to be in the classroom, and also the newer teachers that are in the classroom who are diverse, who may be let go because there is not adequate funding for them. Oh, and all of that goes to say we should support the Student Opportunity Act and ensuring that the funding from the Fair Share Amendment is allocated to our most needy schools so that they can ensure the staffing at steady levels.
Well, sadly, our education system and our leaders, both elected leaders and appointed district leaders, have not learned this lesson around how to reduce its workforce. The 07, 08, 09 economic crisis, we had to deal with massive layoffs, and many districts were not ready for that, did not have RIF policies in place that would protect their best most thoughtful educators, and so here we are many years later dealing with the same thing. We're not well positioned to not have that policy in place. And so you can't now put it in place to try to circumvent this imminent fiscal cliff. Having said that, there's actually a mixed camp out there. There are some people that believe the fiscal cliff is going to solve some of this retention vacant issues. And yet we still have states that are, as we started at the onset of this conversation, dealing with emergency licensure, because they believe the shortage crisis is not going to be resolved and cannot be resolved by this potential influx and reduction in force. But soon we all will know. But nevertheless, we should have been prepared to mitigate this. Dr. Chi, I'm going to come to you. Is there data or a policy recommendation on teacher license reciprocity across states? The question seems to be specifically between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but I know this is a conversation that lawmakers are also grappling with, because they hear this from teachers that relocate, and you hear a lot with military families. So any thoughts on any policy recommendations?
So this is something I wish that we had better evidence on, right? So I feel like there's very little evidence to try to help us think about what's the best way, like, is reciprocity going to be really helpful? Is it not so helpful? And so I would say that the best next move is trying to think about how do we connect data across states so that they can help speak, so the data can speak to each other, to think about what does it mean to have teacher supply just over the border of one state versus the other, and to what extent do we think reciprocity would help in improve matches of teachers to the schools where they need to be. So I wish I had a more thorough answer, but I would say the first step, I think, is to have a better understanding of the landscape so that we can connect data systems, have, let's say, in the example that this person gave, if we could have data from Massachusetts and data for Rhode Island speak to one another, have them linked up so that we can think about what does the pool look like across these states? To what extent do we think folks are moving back and forth across states? I don't think we have a clear understanding of that answer. And so I feel like this is not satisfying, but I think we need more evidence to try to make better policy related to reciprocity. So I think, again, like, not satisfying, but motivating to try to get better evidence and to get better data to speak to one another to be able to say something about it.
Yes, I'd say no, it is not satisfying. I'm not satisfied with that answer. I think the field wants better. We have been working, Rob was talking about the data. We obviously have the data out. I know many of our partner organizations are also collecting data within their context, state and regional context. Their hope is to sort of obviously update the data on an annual basis as the data comes from the state departments, and we are able to aggregate it and land it on our website. But as I mentioned earlier about these licensure exams, we know the research tells us these exams are not indicative of whether it's going to be a good or bad teacher. Yet we know there's probably a significant lobbying interest to keep these exams in place. And those exams are disproportionately keeping Black and Hispanic educator candidates, folks that have graduated from educator prep programs, out of classrooms because they can't attain a license. So that's one thing there. But as we think about reciprocity, if somebody was to graduate from UVA School of Education and they get the Virginia license, to pass this license exam, we know that that's no indication of that's a good or bad teacher. Why is it we're keeping things like we're having these self-inflicted wounds? If we put these hurdles in front of us, why would we not just say, hey, if they're good enough to teach in Virginia, they should be good enough to teach in our state, and vice versa? It seems like in this time of emergency licensures that we should be removing these types of very low-hanging fruit that are, especially with the amount of transients that we have in our military, or even for military families. That's more of a rhetorical question. I'll come to Ralph here. Ralph, 40% of schools in our country do not have a single educator of color. This next question, how can laypersons, folks not involved in the research, approach conversations in their local context beyond just what we know about the benefits of diversifying the workforce to provide the evidence, move the conversation from what I think to what we know and how we know it works? How have you sort of navigated that?
I have something at the tip of my mind that I do want to quickly add before I answer this question. And it's going to be a quick vulnerable moment of me, but I really want to emphasize the point of impact of licensure. As you noted earlier, I have all these awards as teachers, and honestly, just happy to, as a teacher, and I'm just happy to be a teacher effective at my work. But I was also one of those applicants who took the MTEL three times. And that last or second to last time, I was 2 points away. And all I did between the second and the last time was studied the section that they said I was struggling was grammatical syntax. I better understood how to use a semicolon, and that's what I'm attributing to how I was able to pass my MTEL. And if I did not pass it that third time, I would have not have qualified to do my student teaching. So my entire career would have been off, and I don't know if I would have returned to the whole process. So we really do need to think about what are we assessing to say that something speaks to the effectiveness of an educator. And to the second question, how am I navigating through this sphere of having these local conversations? It's really just starts off by having a genuine question. What is a school community doing? What is the data available? And what does the community want to be done? And from there, all I do is connect, like a lot of networking, a lot of connecting with community organizations and local universities to build partnerships for pre-service teachers and practicum students, finding whatever avenue is possible to increase the interest of future educators and provide them access to classrooms so they can get that experience early, so that they can be interested in moving forward through the process. Because we know definitively, specifically in I feel like this is a he is me data point. They say that the earlier you are in a classroom as a prospective Black male educator, from like even childhood, say teaching a classroom because your teacher told you to teach, which happened to me. the more likely you will be interested in being a future teacher. So we need to increase access points across the continuum. And I know of some work being done to even offer early college credit to middle school students so that they could be future prospective teachers and future teachers, of course. So I'm very excited about all the work that's being done.
Thank you, Ralph. Amanda, I'll come to you with this question in conversations you may be having with legislative leaders or policymakers. What data has resonated with that audience strongly, and what areas do they require more understanding or alignment with?
Yeah, so that's a great question. From my experience, what resonates the most is when they see their own data. So from their own districts, and that's what we start with, right? Is we tell the story of what's happening in their own backyard, of their own constituents, and what's affecting their own communities. So that's what grabs the attention. And because the data is so poor in Massachusetts, you can go into any legislative office and talk about the data in their own backyard, and it will resonate that they have a gap. And so how do you close that gap? What we've also found effective is leveraging our colleagues and partners in the Black and Latino caucus. As you might imagine, the stories of education and the education experience from legislators of color, this story of this need for diversification resonates with them. So they are also partners in helping to tell the story with their own colleagues. And that has been also an effective way in which we can get the message across in a way that resonates. So that personal connection of those legislators of color, and then also presenting that data from their own backyard. Those are the two elements that we've seen to be effective.
Well, let me mix it up in our last few minutes here and give you a thought for you, to all three of you to react. And we'll start with Dr. Chi, Ralph, and we'll finish with Amanda. I vividly recall a lawmaker in the South asking if our intentions, if the campaign's intentions were to sort of go back to resegregate schools. The data is quite clear, in fact, that if a student, a Black male, has a Black teacher before third grade, they're 13% more likely to go to university. They have two before third grade, 33% more likely. So the data tells us that Black students benefit. The data also tells us from having a Black teacher. The data also tells us that all students benefit from having a teacher of color, not many teachers of color. I've just shared earlier, 40% of schools don't have a single teacher of color. But this idea that, certainly we're not espousing that we would want to resegregate our schools, but that's what we're combating. That this idea that we're saying we want more educators of color, some might walk away thinking we want Black people to learn from Black teachers, Hispanics from, and so on and so forth. How do we continue to work to diversify our classrooms, our schools, our communities, make sure they're representative of the folks that we're serving, young people, while also not alienating or pushing away electeds or policymakers or voters or families and parents? Dr. Chi, we'll start with you. There's no right or wrong answer here, and I appreciate you indulging me.
Yeah, I think this is a really important question. And in terms of how to communicate the necessity of having a diverse workforce without letting somebody try to push it towards the direction that that you mentioned, saying like, well, to do that, what if we were to resegregate schools? And I don't think anybody wants that. Like, I think that is not at all what the data or the evidence are calling for. I think it's maybe part of it's like thinking about the conversation and trying to say what are ways that we could set it up so that individual students are exposed to the teachers of color within the schools that do have them. So thinking about making sure that, let's say, students of color who are in a school where there are a limited number of teachers of color, is it possible that within that middle school that the students of color have at least one teacher of color within those 3 years, as opposed to having some folks go through those 3 grades without any exposure. So thinking strategically about teacher-student assignment within schools and making sure that exposure is there, and making sure the conversation does focus on the idea that there are benefits even for white students to be exposed to a diverse group of teachers. That's important. We do see these very large benefits for students of color, but I think it is important to just have exposure to diversity for anyone. So I think it's about changing that conversation, veering away from the idea of not letting them bring it to the point where they're pushing for, something as outrageous as resegregation, but trying to veer that conversation back towards what are the practical things that we can do given the status quo, looking at the teachers that we do have available. How do we recruit the right teachers to go to the right schools so that we do have exposure of students of color to teachers of color? In some ways, I think it's like, how do we veer the conversation away from something that's not productive towards those points where there are things that can be done. There are policies that we can enact to help influence even with the status quo that we have. And so I don't think that fully answers it, but that's my initial take on trying to veer away from sort of the negative conversations towards something productive.
Thank you, Dr. G. Ralph?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Dr. Chi that we do have to move the conversation to something that is more productive than something that is quite divisive. And I really leave it at 2 things: that having a diverse workforce promotes cross-cultural social bonding. In a world that is as divisive as it is right now, we need some more positive exposure to different realities than our students are constantly facing and seeing in social media, role models, representation. It's really something empowering for all students, as they will have to enter a world that is globalized and that is highly diverse. We know that there are some figures out there saying by 2050 that the US will be majority minority or majority diverse. So this is something that we have to prepare ourselves to have a deeper understanding of the cultural norms, the behaviors, the deeper context to our identities and the intersectionality of all of our identities, so that we can have an inclusive, supportive, actually healthy environment for everyone participating. And then just to bring it to some data, we know, as a matter of fact, like business theory, organizational behavior, that we are better together. More diverse organizations are more effective, complete tasks more effectively than homogeneous organizations. And you are allowed to have more perspectives in the space that can actually be that can actually support the organization over as a whole. So thank you.
Thank you. Amanda, closing thought?
Yeah, I'll just close out. And Ralph, I couldn't agree with you more. I do think, well, 2 things. It's going to be hard to change the opinions of people who are saying that aren't we trying to resegregate. At the same time, demographic shifts are a reality. There's data that supports the demographic reality. California, 50-50, 53% Latino students in the state of California. Houston ISD, 60% Latino students. This is the workforce of the future. If we are not diversifying our educators, we will not be able to thrive as a country. And that's just, to me, factual when you can present that kind of data on the demographic shifts that we've all got to be dealing with.
Well, I want to thank all 3 of you for your thoughts, your work in the field. I appreciate you taking time to be with us today. This webinar, we will be updating it to the Hunt Institute's YouTube channel Key takeaways from this webinar, along with any facts or resources, will be sent to our audience members that had registered to join us. Please continue to join us for our 1 Million Teachers Color quarterly webinars, as well as the Hunt Institute's Race and Education webinar series. The Hunt Institute is hosting our next Race and Ed webinar, Stay and Prevail. Students of color don't need to leave their communities to succeed, on February 13th from 2 to 3. And this is in partnership with our dear friend and colleague, Nancy Gutierrez. Thank you all. Have a good day. Take good care. Stay safe.